saves them about 2 hours if they just worship with us at Happy Hill and then leave from there of driving time. So that's what they did. So unfortunately, they didn't get to be with us here this morning. But since we have a free house next weekend, Saturday, not Friday, Saturday will be the study at our house if anyone would like to come. 5:30. If anyone's free at 5:30 on Saturday. I know I had made a whole mass confusion of that on Wednesday, so I'm going to repeat again for myself because I'll forget if I don't repeat it again. Saturday, 5:30, our house, if you guys would like to come to the Bible study. This morning I want to talk about the topic of fear. We live in a society that fear is rather common. Personal safety has become a huge topic. Not only just in locking your doors and locking your car, but home protection. Personal protection as you travel. The topic of concealed carry has been one that's been thrown around a lot. Even when it comes to congregations, I know there's a lot of congregations that I've been talking to who have had this conversation amongst themselves of what do we do for protection of the building. I know I was talking to my dad and they've been making their own plans up in Ohio where they live. We had the discussion over Happy Hill. I know that you guys had the discussion up at Haymarket. The topic comes up a lot. We talk about safety for our family as well. We talk to our kids at a very young age about how to stranger danger and all those little catchphrases and all the little phrases they need to know in order to go about safely as possible. Car accidents. We talk, whenever you guys were young, and I was young, what was car safety like when you were younger? I went to college laying in the back of a pickup truck hugging a motorcycle because my parents, I guess, just didn't care about whether or not I was safe around. But the idea, my favorite seat in any car growing up was anything that faced backwards without a seatbelt. And that was like the best time as a kid. We were driving up around DC a couple months ago, and we were looking at a station wagon. In the back of the station wagon was two kids. Man, that is the worst place ever for kids. If anything happens, they're just squished in the back seat. And then it made me realize that the way that I view being a parent and how my parents view being a parent is very different. A lot of that, I think, has to do with the society that we are in. How many times do we fear and worry about the political climate? What's going to happen in the next election or what's going to happen in a couple years in that scenario? Terrorism is something that we didn't think of 25 years ago, domestic terrorism, nearly as much as we think about it nowadays. And I know most of us, or some of us, are in jobs where that is a main topic on a day-to-day basis. Financial crisis. What's going to happen whenever the stock market takes another dip? What happens if we have another 2008 recession? Those things come up all the time. How many times do we have that gut-wrenching fear over death? We do a pretty good job most of days not realizing that death is inevitable for all of us. We do a pretty good job of just living day by day by day. And then every once in a while we have the realization of, oh, that is coming a lot faster than I thought. And you had that moment where your gut just sinks to the bottom, and you had that inexpressible fear of this is going to happen, and it's going to happen before too long. And what's going to happen to my family or my wife or my husband, my kids, whenever I'm gone? Do I have things set up for them if it happens before I'm expecting to happen? Fear is something that we tend to dwell in. It is something that the media sells us on a regular basis because fear sells. So the question comes for us as Christians. So what I want to do is I want to break one of my cardinal rules, and I'm going to put up a lot of passages on the board kind of quickly, and then we're going to slow down and we're going to look at one passage in particular. So there's a lot of commands in the Bible to not fear. Starting back at the kind of beginning in Deuteronomy chapter 1 and verse 21, as Moses is beginning his speeches to the next generation who are going to enter the land of Canaan. See, the Lord your God has set the land before you. Go up, take possession, as the Lord your God of your fathers has told you. Do not fear or be dismayed. And what a challenge for them to be a migrant people who have no idea how to fight wars and battles, and yet God tells them, do not fear and do not be dismayed. Joshua, the next leader in Joshua chapter 1 verse 9, is told the exact same thing. God tells him, have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened and do not be dismayed. for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Being the assistant leader and being the leader is almost a night and day difference sometimes. Having someone to always point to and say, well, Moses, you kind of messed up on that one. Wasn't my responsibility. Is a whole world difference of the buck stops with you. And now he's the one who has to bring this people in who do not know how to fight wars in to fight decades of wars. And God begins by telling him, do not be frightened and do not be dismayed. In 1 Chronicles chapter 22, as David is passing away and Solomon, his son, is taking over, he echoes the words we just read, where he tells Solomon, then you will prosper if you are careful to observe the statutes and the rules of the Lord that God has commanded to Moses for Israel. And he tells him, be strong and courageous, do not fear and do not be dismayed. We have Psalm 46, verses 1 through 7, where the psalmist writes, God is our refuge and our strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth give way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble at its swelling. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of her, she shall not be moved. God will help her when morning dawns. The nations rage, the kingdoms totter. He utters his voice, and the earth melts. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Though, look back there in verse 2, though the earth give way, and though the mountains be moved, and though the waters roar, God is our refuge and our strength. Consider that. In Psalm 118, this psalm is quoted in Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 6. If it sounds familiar, you probably know it from Hebrews 13. The Lord is on my side, I will not fear, for what can man do to me? See, those things sound so simple, don't they? God's on my side, what can man do to me? And yet, whenever we are actually facing what man can do to us, fear arises so quickly. In Luke chapter 12, in verse 4, 7, and 32, 3 times in this chapter, Jesus is speaking, and he tells his audience to not fear. I tell you, my friends, do not fear those who can kill the body, and after that have nothing more that they can do. And in verse 7, why, even the hairs of your head are numbered. Fear not, you are of more value than many sparrows. And again in verse 32, fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. The disciples were going to be facing a lot. And if history is accurate, secular history is accurate, all but John die a very premature, very gruesome death. And yet Jesus begins this by telling them in verse 4, do not fear those who kill the body. He doesn't promise them that no one's going to kill their body. He tells them not to fear them. So I'd like to do, in Romans chapter 8, sorry, I skipped ahead myself. Romans chapter 8, verse 15. For you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received the spirit of adoption as sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Father. It's a very similar phrase that he uses in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7. We do not have a spirit of fear, a power and self-control. So what I'd like to do is to look at Mark chapter 4. We're going to take some time, we're going to read through this account in Mark chapter 4, and we're going to try to glean the information that Jesus lays out for us in Mark chapter 4 in regards to fear and faith. And we're going to start there, Mark chapter 4, starting in verse 35. So on that day, when evening had come, he said to them, let us go across to the other side. And leaving the crowd, he took them into the boat, just as he was, and the other boats were with them. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so the boat was already filling. But when he was in the stern, asleep in the cushion, and they woke him, and they said, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? And he awoke, and he rebuked the wind, and said to the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said to them, Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith? And they were filled with great fear, and they said to one another, Who is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? If we're going to look at Mark chapter 4, we're going to ask the question, what does fear demonstrate. Here are the disciples who are in a boat, they're in a storm, in the open water. I would be afraid. There is no doubt in my mind that I would be afraid. Open water, calm water, during the daylight, I'm still not overly comfortable. In the dark, in a storm, not nearly as comfortable. And yet Jesus rebukes them and asks them, have you still no faith? And so fear demonstrates a fundamental lack of faith. There really is no two ways around it. That's how Jesus puts it there in verse 40. Why are you still afraid? Do you still not have faith? Those two ideas are inextricably linked. We're going to use much smaller words today. Ones we can pronounce, not even pronounce. He links those two ideas together. We also see here in Mark chapter 4, back in verse 38, fear assumes certain things about God. Fear assumes that God does not care. That's the first question that they asked there in verse 38. Jesus was asleep in the stern, down on the cushion, and the apostles wake him, and they ask him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? Sometimes that is the fundamental thought that we have. I'm going through this turmoil. I'm going through this storm in my life. I'm having these struggles. Why doesn't God care? That's kind of where we started in Habakkuk this morning in chapter 1. Why is it, God? Or how long is the first question. How long do I have to do this? And then why is it that you don't care that I have to witness all this in my life? Where is your salvation is the question. And that's what they're asking here in Mark chapter 4. Do you not care? Whenever we think about some of the fundamental problems that people have in coming to faith in a God in the first place, and let alone a personal God, one of the questions that comes up is if God is all-knowing and all-powerful, and if he truly loves you, why would he allow you to go through those things? There's that lack of faith and the idea that God doesn't care. And this is the same thing that all of us have to wrestle with at some point in time in our life. If I'm going through this right now, and if God can take care of it earlier, why hasn't he taken care of it now? Is it that he doesn't care? We also see that fear assumes that God cannot or will not help. A couple verses later in verse 41, they marvel amongst themselves, who is this that even the wind and the waves obey? When it comes to our personal struggles, whatever we're facing in our life, it may not ever be a boat in the middle of the water in a storm, but whatever it is that is your turmoil in your life, if you can't see a way out, do you have faith that God can? They didn't see a way out. They wanted him to wake up. I'm not sure what their intentions were, just so everyone got to be awake, everyone got to be afraid together. I'm not sure. But they didn't see a way out. They didn't expect God's ability to be that he could calm the storm with just simply speaking a word. Do we see that in our lives? If there is a storm that we can't see our way out, there's a problem and a conundrum that we can't think our way through, do we assume that God can't either? And fear assumes that God cannot or maybe will not. Maybe he could do it for somebody else, but he may not do that for me. And fear assumes that God wouldn't be willing to or wouldn't be able to. Fear also assumes that God only works in the calm. There in verse 38, that Jesus was asleep on the cushion. Well, if he's asleep on the cushion, then God certainly isn't doing anything. He's asleep on the cushion. Where is he doing his work? And fear assumes that if things are going well, that's when God's working in our lives. And if things are going poorly, that's when God isn't working in our lives. And that's a really, really wrong way to look at it. We'll talk about that in a moment. So let's talk about the God in the storm, because that's what's happening here. The apostles, Jesus are in the storm. What does God do in this case? And I would suggest to you that God is with us in the storm. Let's look at Matthew chapter 28 and verse 20. Remember whenever you were a kid and you were afraid of the dark? Or remember last night when you were afraid of the dark? Whether or not you have grown out of that or not. And remember maybe having a brother or a sister who wasn't nearly as afraid as you were, and so you would grab them and walk down the hall with them until they got to turn on the light for you? What was your 5-year-old brother going to do for you? If there was whatever that boogeyman was that in your house that you were afraid of, what was your little sister going to do for you standing beside you? The answer is absolutely nothing. There's nothing that they would really be able to do for you if there's really a danger. But just having someone beside you made all the difference. There's a really good reason that in Luke chapter 10, Jesus sends out the 70 to go preach and teach 2 by 2. And Solomon makes the point over Ecclesiastes that 2 individuals together are stronger than each individual separate, and 3-fold cord is not quickly broken. And so here in Matthew chapter 28, there in verse 20, when Jesus is sending them out to go and do their work, he tells them in verse 19, "Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you, and behold, I am with you always, to the end of the age." Sometimes we feel that God has abandoned us because the storm is there. And he has promised us that he will always be with us. And much more than a little 5-year-old sister or a little 5-year-old brother can't do anything for you. We have a God who is with us and is unbelievably powerful. That God is promising that always. In Acts chapter 18, turn with me there. In Acts chapter 18, we'll look at verse 10. Here Paul is in Corinth. And Paul receives a vision there in verse 9. The Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, "Do not be afraid, but go on speaking and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you, for I have many in this city who are my people." And he stayed there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. The same promise that was given over in Acts chapter 28 is reiterated to Paul in this verse. I'm with you. And that should be a huge comfort to us. That even if the storm arises, they were there with Jesus in the boat, and the storm arose, didn't mean that he wasn't with them. And just because he appeared to be asleep and therefore out of commission, or however you would want to phrase that, out of ability to recognize or protect or to do anything, he was with them. And that was way more than they realized. And the same thing goes for us. Sometimes we think God is only with us whenever things are going really well. And we ask the question as we look at Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me when things look terrible? But by the middle of Psalm 22, the psalmist makes the point that you have delivered, that you have rescued, that you have always been there. And the same thing goes in Isaiah 53, where everything looks dire and drear for God's chosen one, the one that is there. And he makes the point that he has raised him and he has saved him. That when things look drear and when things look bad, God is still with them in the storms. Not only that, but turn with me to John chapter 11. Not only is God with us, but he also cares for us in the storm. We had wrestled with this passage as we went through this on our Wednesday night class through John a couple weeks ago. Jesus receives word that his friend Lazarus is sick, to the point of death. That's a big storm in a life, isn't it? 2 sisters and a brother who were living together. He's going to be probably most likely their main source of income. Not only that, just simply being family, being their brother. And he is sick to the point of death, and you know someone who can heal. So you send word to them, and Jesus just sits there for 2 days so that he could let Lazarus die. It's a really weird way of looking at it, isn't it? It's a hard passage to get through. If you don't know what happens at the end of chapter 11, that first part's really difficult. If you care during this storm, why aren't you here? And that's Mary's point. As Mary comes up, if you had been here, our brother would not have died. But here in verse 33, as they're heading towards the tomb, Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping. He was moved deeply in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he asked, "Where have you laid him?" And they said to him, "Lord, come and see." And Jesus wept. And the Jews said, see how much he loved him. Was Jesus unmoved? I mean, this is his plan. And he knew what was going to happen. He knew that in a few minutes Lazarus was going to rise and all that sorrow was going to be turned to joy, and that this amazing thing was going to happen that everyone for the rest of history would get to know about. Does it mean that he was unmoved by their sorrow in the storm? Not at all. The same thing happens as we look over here in Luke chapter 7. If you go back a few pages into Luke chapter 7. We'll look at verse, with the widow here, verses 11 down to verse 13. So we see in verse 12, as he drew near to the gates of the town, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a considerable crowd of the town was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, and told her, do not weep. And we know in this passage, he raises her son. But imagine it from her standpoint. She's a widow, which means she's already been through this with her husband. This is her only son. This is all that she has left. And house, donkey, horse, whatever it is that you might have, if it's your kid, that's all you have. And he dies. And the question comes up, Lord, do you not care? Where are you in this storm? The question comes up, did God not care? He is moved with compassion. The same thing comes up again in chapter 19 in a very similar circumstance, but Jesus is moved to compassion. We won't take the time to look through all of that. And that's the one where he weeps over Jerusalem, the city that he's entering into for the very last time, where the people are going to have a kangaroo court and a mock trial in order to get him crucified on any grounds possible in under a week's time. The city that's going to kill him is the one that he weeps over and is moved with compassion. God not only is with us in the storm, but he also cares for us in the storm. But more than that, he brings good from the storm. We have looked at Genesis chapter 50 there in verse 20, I think a week or two ago. We had talked about Joseph. And Joseph's story of how, where was God in all the things that he was allowed to go through. And after his father had died, his brothers come to him, and they're afraid that now his father's gone, he's going to bring retribution on them. And he tells them in verse 19, do not fear, for I am in peace, or am I in the place of God. And in verse 20, he tells them that you meant this for evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. It took, I'm fairly convinced it took Joseph a long time to see that end. It took him probably all of his time being in Potiphar's house, and all the time being in prison, and probably several years at being at Pharaoh's side before he realized that God brought this about for his family's good. But it wasn't that God didn't care, and it wasn't that he wasn't there with him. In fact, we get to see that the whole way, isn't it? That he prospered at Potiphar's house. He prospered in the prison. He was able to interpret dreams for both the baker and the cupbearer, and for Pharaoh. God was with him through all of that. Let him suffer through it, but he was with it, and he cared for him, and ultimately brought good from it. In Philippians chapter 1, and the same thing comes up as Paul's put into prison. Remember, he's beaten in Jerusalem for a crime that he didn't commit. He is then transferred to Caesarea because there's a plot against his life. And then the king just can't make up his mind what to do with him. He's dragging his heels on purpose. And so Paul gets fed up, and he finally appeals to Caesar. So after waiting for 2 years in prison, he then gets carted off to Rome, shipwrecked, and then has to finally finish up in Rome. And Paul's answer to all of this, there in chapter 1 and verse 12, he says, I want you to know, brethren, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. Was it that God wasn't there with him? Every step of the way, God took care of him and provided for him. He suffered sometimes for it. It wasn't that God didn't care, but God ultimately brought about a good that Paul couldn't have brought about by himself through it. So let's talk about the idea of letting go of fear. That if God is with us in the storm, and God cares for us in the storm, and God ultimately brings good about through it, how do we let go of that? And the first step I would suggest is simply be introspective. Ask yourself, what is it that you're afraid of? And why? If I'm afraid of my financial situation, it's because that I don't believe that God cares for my financial situation. If I fear for my family, is it that I believe that God cannot keep them safe without me completely and ultimately keeping control of all that? Do I fear for my personal safety, or do I fear when I come into services that something might happen? Why is that? Is it because I ultimately have a lack of faith? The answer is going to be yes. I'm just going to cut to the chase for that one. But what area is it? Is it that I don't think that God would care for me? Is it that I don't think that God cares in general, or that he could bring about good? Be introspective in the first place to recognize it. The second thing I would suggest is pray for help and for healing. We were there in Habakkuk chapter 2 and verse 1 this morning in our Bible class. That Habakkuk says, I will take my place on my watchtower, and I will stand and wait for God's answer. In Colossians chapter 4, there in verse 2, he tells us to be steadfast in prayer and to be watchful in our prayer. Not only do we pray for the things we're waiting for, but we're going to stand there and we're going to wait for the answer. Pray for healing and pray for help. We see that over and over and over again in the book of Psalms, where the psalmist cries out to God for deliverance, cries for help, pleads for him, because God is there. I would tell us to take some time to evaluate our past storms. And we have this really unique way of being short-sighted and very goldfish memory. We'll make that into a term. Remember the goldfish who swims around the bowl, and every time he gets super excited that there's a castle, swims around the bowl, we go, oh, another castle? That's how we do when it comes to problems in our lives. Every problem's like, oh, it's the worst thing in the world. How is this ever going to be resolved? And we forgot that 2 months ago, we had the worst thing that ever happened in our lives, and we never knew how it was going to be resolved. And it resolved so well, and there were such great blessings from it, that we've forgotten it already. Every single time that we face a challenge, it's as if we had this brand new challenge that we've never faced before, and we have no idea how things are ever going to work out, because we've forgotten all the past things. And so Paul tells his readers, remember what happened to me in the past. And he asks them to remember what happened to them. In Matthew, we were going through this on Friday, in successive chapters 14, chapter 15, he feeds 5,000 men plus women and children. And in the next chapter, he feeds 4,000 men and women, or men plus women and children. And then the next chapter, they're riding again on a boat. They're on boats a lot. And he warns them about the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. He questions them, have you forgotten about the 4,000 and the 5,000 that I fed? Have you already forgotten it? It just happened. Have you lost faith? Have you lost your memory already? And that happens to us all the time. Haven't you remember how God got you through the last thing? And that should be a huge benefit for us. Being able to look back and to see the things that God has already provided, that he's already taken care of, the problems that we thought were going to be problems that never were problems, the problems that were problems that God still handled, and the heartbreaking things that we suffered through that we can look back and say, I understand now. In James chapter 5, he makes the point, see then the purpose of the Lord in concerning Job. Job couldn't see God's purpose because he was too busy being Job. But us, thousands of years removed, we can step back and say, okay, I can see the purpose of the Lord in Job. And sometimes we are too busy being us, to see the purpose of the Lord in our lives. And sometimes we need to just have faith that whatever God is working in us and through us is going to be for our benefit. Look past the storm to the ultimate end. James begins with that in James chapter 1. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you face trials of various kinds. And what he doesn't say is because today is going to be really terrible and you're going to wish that tomorrow doesn't come. What he tells them is look past that to the ultimate end. That this problem is going to produce in you steadfastness. And that steadfastness, when it has run its course, it's going to make you perfect and complete and lacking in nothing. And Peter tells his same audience, his audience over in 1 Peter chapter 1, that if you're grieved for a temporary time, rejoice in this, that it's going to refine you into something greater. That's what we're always told to do, is look past the current struggle into the ultimate goal that God can work in our lives. And ultimately, choose faith. I know that rolls off the tongue really easy. It sounds super simple, and it's not. But there are times that the righteous live by faith. Again, Habakkuk always, whatever John goes through, it seems to fit in really well. Habakkuk quotes there in he writes there in chapter 2 from God that the righteous shall live by faith. Paul quotes that in Romans chapter 1 that the righteous shall live by faith. He repeats that in Galatians chapter 3 that the righteous shall live by faith. And the Hebrew writer repeats that again in Hebrews chapter 12 that the righteous shall live by faith. And sometimes we want to live only by sight. I want to only make the choices that I feel comfortable with because I can see the ultimate end to. I want to believe in God only whenever I can see what God is going to be able to do. But what happens whenever I'm in the middle of the storm and it's so pitch black out that I can't see 30 seconds in front of me, let alone the ultimate end, what it's exactly going to be? And that's where he tells in Mark chapter 4, do you still have no faith? Are you still at that point where you can't choose to believe in God? We have to look back. We have to see what God has done and been able to do in our lives. Not only what he has done in our lives, what he has been able to do in other people's lives. We have literally an entire book of what God has been able to do. And we need to sit back and say, I know who God is. I don't have to say, who is this that with his voice can calm the wind and the storm? I know who that is. And if he can do that, then whatever's in my life, he can work together for good, for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Choose faith. And so that's my simple 5 steps, is be introspective. Understand why you have fear and what you're afraid of. Pray for help and for healing. The individual who says, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. We can pray that way. Evaluate the past storms in our lives and others that we know and what God has done in them. Look past the current thing that we're going through to see the ultimate end. And eventually, and ultimately, choose faith. Believe that God knows what he's doing, that he does care, that he is with us, and that he can work good in the storm. Then this is picked up number 836. If there's anything we can do for you, any help or prayers or encouragement, as you go through your storms of life, if there's anything we can do, we are here to do just that. To uphold one another, to uplift one another, to encourage one another, to bear with one another. And sometimes we have to have faith in God that he has put people in our lives to do just that. If we help you to do that this morning, let us know as we stand and sing number 836.
What will you do?